Okay, good afternoon. This is supposed to be Money 4.0, but I was able to persuade people that what I'm going to talk about is a little bit more about macroeconomics 4.0. And I'll try and go through this swiftly. I have a few slides, but I'm hoping I can stick to the 20 minutes that I have allotted. And we think about economics or macroeconomics 4.0, I want to start with this, which is the traditional economic model. So many of you who've done Economics 101 are familiar with this. So at the left are kids. Kids basically, if Kailash has his way, have a good time. Then in the middle is the working population. And there, this is the simplified diagram without government and international trade. But basically, companies produce, workers get wages, workers consume, and companies provide goods. So it's a circular economy. Wages from companies wind up as income to create demand, and the surplus and net surpluses move out to the right of the chart, which is savings get created, savings go into pension plans, retirement, etc. You're supposed to work till you're about 60, 65. You're supposed to live till you're about 75. So the savings and pensions that get created are adequate to serve your needs for the balance 8, 10 years that you have to live. Now, there's a problem with this model, which obviously everybody knows is quite evident, that a number of things are changing. And obviously, the first thing that's changing is this, we are living much longer. People have talked about it this morning. We're living much longer, but also the important parts of the living much longer, which are proving to be challenging in terms of the affordability of being able to live much longer. So this chart just tells you, last year for the first time, the number of people who are over 65 were larger than the number of people who are below the age of 5. This is the first time ever that's happened. That's about 500 million people. In the next couple of decades, there's going to be 1 billion people. And if you look at the projection of the red graph, it's just going one way. So a lot of older people on planet Earth. The second life chart tells you life expectancies. So again, the life expectancy chart is going only one way. And this is before the impact of the new biotechnology revolution. With the new biotech revolution, it is expected that lifespans can start hitting 150 years. So you're looking at a world where you're going to have a lot of old fogies like me and a lot less fewer people. You know, maybe in the future, Kailash won't have a problem, there are no kids. Healthcare costs. This is quite clear. Healthcare costs are rising. And despite, notwithstanding, you know, we are now getting digitized insurance and all of the good stuff. The reality is the cost of healthcare is because cost of medicine in the system is continuing to rise. Now, maybe technology will impact that. But the truth is, if you read, those of you who've read this, I forget the guy's name, Atul Gawankar's book, right? The maximum amount of medical expenditure happens in the last 1 year of your life. So you think about people living longer and healthcare getting more expensive. As people are getting longer, you find that healthcare costs at the end will continue to increase. Now, this is a different part of the problem. So I said there's a problem that, you know, living longer, healthcare costs are increasing. There's a different dimension of the problem which continues to affect the right side of the chart, and that is your capacity to save. The earnings you're getting on your savings, that is beginning to be dramatically negatively impacted. So what the chart shows you, the chart on the left, is the percentage of bonds in the world which have a negative yield. And as you can see, all the way through till 2013, 15, that's zero. I mean, obviously, nobody ever thought of this concept of negative interest rates. And then you look at how the graph takes off. It's incredible that today, as much as 25% of all bonds in the world have a negative yield. That's just unbelievable, that people are willing to effectively give you money to give you a loan. I'll show you some of that. And what's happening on the right side of the chart is bond yields are continuing to come down across them. Even where you don't have a negative yields are at historic lows. The yields on the 30-year US bond earlier this week, for the first time, went below 2%. The yields on the 10-year in the US just crashed below 1.5. And across the world, country after country, yields are coming down. Now, that has obvious implications. If interest rates are coming down and yields are coming down, then how do you wind up creating adequate savings to pay for the 5, 10, 15 years that you're supposed to pay for after you retire? You can see what's happening. So Nordic banks are today beginning to pay you negative interest rate. If you pay deposits, leave deposits in the bank, you got to pay the bank money. But equally, last week, for the first time, a couple of Danish banks announced negative interest rate mortgage loans. So if you take a home loan from the bank, they'll pay you money. And I mean, my brain still can't deal with this. Why would people not want to take as much money as you want to give me since you're going to pay me for it? But you know, the world's turning upside down. And what's happening on the right side is therefore pensions are getting massively underfunded. It's true for government pensions, but it's also true for private pensions. So that data reflects S&P, the top 1,500 companies, the FTSE, the top 350 companies. The size of the underfunding of pensions is anything from $300 billion to $500 billion today. So you have a problem waiting to happen, which is that people are living longer, costs are rising, but what they thought they'd save, what you thought you had saved to last you for the rest of your life, that money is not there. So how are you going to live? Well, you're going to live because of this. So you're going to live because you hope your kids and the younger people are going to keep taking care of you. Now, that's called the dependency ratio. How many people are out there hoping that their kids and grandkids are going to take care of them? Well, the problem is the dependency ratio is rising. And so you have a bunch of smaller population over here and a larger population over here. How do you think this equation can continue to succeed? It's not obvious. Now, the other problem that's happening with this is to address this pension issue, people are pushing retirement age out. So in Singapore, as you know, retirement age is 62. You're supposed to re-employ to 67. Within the next 5 years, they plan to shift that to 65 and 70, which means that people are going to retire longer. That's good in the one hand because you're not going to dip into your pension pool so soon, but it's bad on the other hand. Why? Because what happens to the younger people who want those jobs? They're going to be crowded out of the same employment pool. So this dependency ratio problem is going to become an even bigger problem as we speak. Second set of problems, because the machines are winning. And the machines are winning, it has a dramatic impact on jobs. So if you look at this, we've talked about the first, second, third, fourth industrial revolutions, but I think what is quite, to me, the most compelling story is this. In '97, for the first time, Deep Blue beat Kasparov at chess. Right? And there's a big hoo-ha. It was supposed to be a seminal moment when we finally figured the machines could be smarter than us. In 2016, AlphaGo, it won 4-1 in Go. Now, as you know, Go is far more complicated than chess. 300 times more possibilities. It requires intelligence, creativity. It requires some intuition, and so on. To me, that's not the most remarkable story. The most remarkable story is 1 year later, a new AlphaGo 0 comes in, and it beats the old AlphaGo 100-0. 100-0. So why the new AlphaGo is now into self-learning? It's neural self-learning. So today you got machines which are not just crunching big power to win, they are beginning to think like us. And they're beginning to think like us with intuition, with sophistication. Now, the data point that somebody mentioned this morning, 57% of jobs are going to change. That's quite apparent. When machines start thinking and behaving like us, every job is at risk. So you can see that's already happening. This tells you which industry jobs are going to go. But to me, this is another important thing. You take General Electric. It was one of the most preeminent companies in the world. It had 25 billion in revenues, 400,000 employees in 1980. Today, Apple, 10 times more revenues, employs only 130,000 people. And if you look at the projection, the big wealth creation, this thing in the world, people don't need people. So the automation and machines are taking care of it. You're seeing growing inequality. Inequality, Marx spoke about it. The whole idea of his critique of capitalism is that at the end of the day, you get concentration of wealth. Once you get concentration of wealth, you wind up with emancipation of the workforce, and then you wind up with revolution. Kuznets and people through the 20th century posited that this doesn't always happen. And the theory was that you'll see increasing inequality up to a point in time, the rise in the curve, and then it starts coming down because the increased richness in society starts moving back to society, people, jobs get created, so the curve starts coming down. Well, Piketty in his book, Piketty and People, showed this curve. They call it the Loch Ness curve because it looks like a Loch Ness monster. And their data suggests that actually inequality increases dramatically. The left end of the curve shows that in emerging markets in the last decade, last few years, inequality is reduced because incomes have gone up. China in particular, India, poverty line, and so on. But the middle classes in the Western world, real incomes have come down. And the only people who really benefited is at the tail end of the curve, which is the 1%. And that's why his big Piketty thing about 1%. This is another chart from Piketty, which is the returns to capital versus the returns to labor. If you look at the red chart over the last few decades, that's what capital is returning. The blue chart is what labor is getting. So tells you that there is something going on, which is more and more money is getting concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. So the bottom line to me is this, that you have a problem at both ends of the old economic model. At one end, not enough pensions, not enough savings, older lives, healthcare costs. At the other end, not enough jobs, computers taking over, and therefore you have this whole tension which is hitting you on both sides. So the economic model that we're used to, which is the last couple of 100 years, Adam Smith, free markets, everything takes care of, to my mind, this economic model is not sustainable. And there are going to be some fundamental changes. Now, there's some scenarios. I'm not a soothsayer. I don't know what will work, but I want to give you some ideas. One, you could argue that you're going to have a self-correcting system. Now, Adam Smith, the free market economy allocates resources and labor. The first thing that could happen, wages could start rising suddenly. Not impossible. Henry Ford was famous for this. He paid his workers way over average salaries. And his theory was, if I pay my workers, they're the guys who are going to buy my cars. People asked him, who's going to buy a car? He said, I'll pay the workers well, they'll buy the cars. So what happens if you're producing lots of goods and there are no wages, and then nobody can buy your stuff? And therefore, there's a possibility that wages start rising in a self-correcting mechanism. So not impossible. The reality is we're not seeing it right now. Wage pressure is not showing up anywhere in the world. In fact, even organized labor and the power of unions is reduced, and thus, therefore, creating a world you're not seeing this thing happening could happen. Second thing could happen. People might start getting paid not for work, but for other things, consumption, or particularly data. You're beginning to see that. People are getting paid for data so they can consume. I've got half a dozen examples here. Wipson is a token which they give people roughly 2 paisa every time you give some information from Facebook or whatever to them. The second one is a company which gives you money just to take your junk mail so they can analyze what you do. The third is Nielsen. Nielsen pays you money if you can scan your grocery receipt and send it up to them so they know what to keep and buy. They pay you money to do that. And so on and so forth. There's the company which pays you to drink beer. There's another company which pays you to watch movies and so on. So it's possible that people get paid not for wages, for work, but start getting paid for something different. Now, this obviously changes the economic model because you're paying for consumption, but that could happen to try and get a circular economy in place. Third thing that could happen is prices could drop. You, by the way, need to see that. I fundamentally believe technology is deflationary. And you're seeing the impact of technology on price after price. It's there in travel, it's there in telcos, it's there in banking. Nobody has pricing power today. Nobody's being able to charge. Partly it's efficiency, but to a large extent, it's transparency. And therefore, the value surplus is moving to the consumer. So maybe you wind up in a world where you have self-correcting prices. Finally, you could wind up in this world where this whole model destroys. I said they're producers and they're consumers. Well, in today's world, they're only prosumers. Everybody is a producer and a consumer. Everybody produces and consumes, so you could create a gig economy. Everybody is a self-employed entrepreneur, and everybody takes care of themselves. So you could have any of these self-correcting economic systems. The other thing you could have is this, government interventions. So government interventions, I think there are two things which you will definitely see. I'm quite this thing. One, you will see a lot more state welfare statism. And you will see that because you will find the pressure from governments to start tilting left. To take care of the bottom 20%, the bottom 50%, the people who are disenfranchised. You already see that in the data point. Between 1960 and today, the percentage of government spend on social protection is up to about 20%. You saw that in Singapore after the 2011 elections, when the government had this reduce and vote share, the government very quickly calibrated left. So Silverhead program, youth program, skills program. And so you're seeing this in country after country. You have to start doing this. I'm pretty sure that this is a trend that you will see a lot of. The second trend you might see is this trend of universal basic income. Just give people, the simple definition of it is, give people money to exist. So the fact that you're born entitles you to an income, you get an income from that. It's slightly different from a dole or social security, and it's different because it doesn't come with strings and conditions. It comes with no bureaucracy. Everybody gets their couple of $1,000 on this. Some people have argued that this doesn't work because, if you essentially have the situation, the cartoon which says you work hard and you keep half the money, or you do no work and get paid. Everybody will obviously do no work and get paid. But the reality is the few experiments that have been done. The experiment done in Canada in 1974, the experiment was done, they actually, for some strange reason, didn't go through the analytics of the experiment. For 4 years, they gave people a couple of $1,000 to all the unemployed people, just gave the money. Then they forgot about the data. Ironically, about 3-4 years ago, a professor called Evelyn Forget, and Forget is ironic, went and found that data, and then did the analytics and showed that in that 4 years, everybody did an extra year of school, healthcare costs came down, and most importantly, employment rates stayed up. They did the experiment in Finland last year, less conclusive because it was not that well controlled. They did the experiment in Kenya and in Tanzania. By and large, it seems to suggest that there might be something to this. By the way, guess who the biggest proponents of this thing were? It weren't the lefties and Democrats. The biggest proponents of universal basic income, Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, all big fans of this. So I think you might see some of that. The problem with this, of course, is how do governments pay for this if they're going to do that? So the second thing which I'm saying is people say that's bound to happen is tax. I think taxes are going up across the board. Taxes will go up in every form. Income tax, wealth tax, estate duty, capital gains tax. In the next decade, mark my words, all taxes are headed only one way. So you think about your financial planning, better think about that. Right? Warren Buffett famously pays less tax than his secretary. And he went and told the whole world, this is bizarre. I pay less tax than my secretary, there's something wrong with our system. And why? Because he gets paid in dividends and capital gains. That's tax-free. His secretary gets income tax, she gets taxed, right? So I think you're going to see a lot of this. You can find that there's a call for higher taxes. Elizabeth Warren's whole stand on the Democratic side is higher taxes. If you look at what Hang Sik-Wet did over here, he's already announced higher GST up to 2025. You look at what Nirmala Sitharaman did in India, first thing, the Robin Hood tax. If you're 2 to 5 crores, 3% more. If you're over 5 crores, 7% more. These are not isolated instances. I think this is a trend which you'll see around the world, an increase in tax rates. The last thing that could happen, I'm less certain about this, but I think it will happen, is an increase in state ownership of means of production, which is bizarre because it means like going back to communism and socialism. But I think people are beginning to recognize is that there is a way to have state ownership of assets without necessarily the inefficiencies that come from a bloated public sector. And the Singapore model proves that. Temasek owns half the country, including us. And despite that, they run it efficiently, there's an independent board. The advantage of this is the states, if you look at the Singapore budget, a substantial chunk of Singapore's revenues don't come from tax. They come from the dividends and earnings that Temasek and GIC get from people like us. And they use that to subsidize the rest of the system. They're beginning to talk about greater state ownership in many of the East European states. Of course you would, because they've got communist backgrounds. But I think you might see something like this. I think you might also see some responses which are more social responses, society-driven responses or outcomes. So one is this. It is not impossible to me that you start seeing a system of a lot more quasi-barter. So people start trying to create a parallel economy. So these things are the things called complementary currencies, where people start exchanging services with each other, not dissimilar for internet, but also in the offline world, for tokens or some other means of quasi-currency. In a place in Kenya, they have something called Bangla Pesa. It's a small village community, and they basically give tokens to each other, so for providing services for each other. And they found the very the act of trying to do something in a complementary currency is resulting in greater sales at an individual and at an aggregate level. So I think you'll find a lot of community groups trying to get together to look for unorthodox systems of trade and benefiting each other. The other thing I think you will see a lot more of is philanthropy. You're seeing people, like I said before, now there are a bunch of people who say you should tax me, I'm richer, but certainly a lot of people are saying I need to go back and share the money that I have. So inherited wealth is going to start coming under more question, and I think there'll be greater expectation on people to give back so you can go back to society. So I think you might see more of that. And finally, I think in the corporate agenda, so people like me and a lot of people in companies are quite clearly shifting from what's now popularly called the shift from shareholder to stakeholder, which means the recognition that you've got to start making a contribution to communities and societies, which is more than just the profits that you earn. So looking at environment, social, the ESG issues, or people, profit, planet, or people call it different names, but the fundamental realization that if companies need to exist, they've got to get a social license to exist. And the social license will only come if they directly contribute and participate in this redistributive agenda that we all need as we go forward. So that's my last slide. It's just this. I think economics 4.0 is going to be very fundamentally different from the models that we've got used to in the 20th century. But at the heart of economics 4.0, I think will be this that Marshall McLuhan said, that we have become irrevocably involved with, responsible for each other. I don't think there's a choice. We're just going to have to rethink the systems that make us work and collaborate in the world that is to come. Thank you all.